On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled hit the United States Pacific Fleet with surgical precision. Battleships capsized, airfields burned, and for a few hours the Imperial Japanese Navy looked like something genuinely unstoppable. Then, less than 4 years later, Japan had essentially no functioning navy left. So what happened? Was Japan's early dominance a mirage, a lucky streak? Or was there a version of history where things genuinely went the other way, where Japan didn't just win a battle but actually broke American naval power in the Pacific for good? That question sounds simple, but the moment you start pulling at it, it gets complicated fast. Here's the thing that most casual accounts of the Pacific War get wrong. They treat Pearl Harbor like a near miss. The idea goes something like this. If Japan had only launched a third wave, if they'd hit the fuel storage, if they'd caught the carriers in port, the whole war might have ended differently. It's a compelling story. It's also built on a foundation that doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny, because it assumes Japan's problem was tactical execution when the real constraints ran much deeper than that. What would it have actually meant for Japan to beat the U.S. Pacific Fleet in any meaningful sense? Not just sink ships, though that matters, but win in a way that changed the outcome of the war. That's a different question entirely, and it forces us to think beyond the dramatic images of burning battleships and into the less cinematic machinery of industrial output, petroleum reserves, replacement pilot programs, logistics chains, and signals intelligence. None of that makes for great Hollywood drama, but all of it was arguably more decisive than any single naval engagement. Because here's the paradox at the center of this story. Japan entered the Pacific War with some genuinely impressive advantages. Its carrier air groups were among the most experienced and lethally trained in the world. Its torpedo technology was, in several respects, ahead of anything the Americans had. Its doctrine for night surface combat was sophisticated and battle-tested. In the opening months of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy performed at an extraordinarily high level across an enormous operational theatre. And yet the underlying balance of power was always unfavourable in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could permanently overcome. So, throughout this video, we're going to hold both of those realities in tension. Yes, Japan was a formidable naval power, arguably the finest in the Pacific at the moment the war started. But formidable is not the same as capable of winning. The test we're going to apply isn't whether Japan could strike devastating blows, because clearly it could. The real test is whether Japan was ever strong enough, in a durable and structural sense, to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a way that would have forced a war-winning strategic outcome. To answer that, we need to define what beating actually means. We need to look honestly at how the two navies compared on paper and in practice. We need to trace where Japan's real advantages lived and where they ran out. And we need to ask whether even the best possible decisions could have changed the math that ultimately drove this war. Let's start by establishing what the scorecard actually looked like before a single shot was fired, before we can answer whether Japan was strong enough to beat the US. Pacific Fleet. We have to agree on what beating actually means, because the word is doing a lot of work. And if we leave it undefined, we'll talk past the most interesting parts of the question. The most intuitive definition is also the most limited, destroying the American fleet in a decisive naval battle. Sink enough ships, kill enough sailors, eliminate enough carriers and battleships, and you've won. This is essentially the logic behind Japan's strategic doctrine going into the war, the Kantai-Kessen, or decisive fleet engagement, and it's a framework that made a certain kind of sense given Japan's position. If you can't match your enemy's industrial capacity, you concentrate on destroying his military instrument before he can use it. You force a single catastrophic engagement, annihilate what he has, and then bargain from a position of sudden strength. But here's the problem with stopping at that definition. Destroying a fleet and winning a war are two very different accomplishments. The United States in 1941 was not a nation that could be defeated purely by military means. It had the industrial base to build another fleet, and then another one after that. It had a political culture that, once mobilized, was unlikely to accept a negotiated settlement simply because a collection of warships had been sunk in the Pacific. If Japan's goal was to make the United States give up and go home by inflicting enough naval pain, then the scale of destruction required wasn't just large. It was almost certainly beyond anything Japan could realistically achieve, even under the most optimistic circumstances. So the more precise and historically honest way to frame Japan's victory condition isn't annihilation, it's coercion. The Japanese leadership in 1941 wasn't actually hoping to conquer the United States. What they wanted was to seize and consolidate a resource empire in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, build a defensive perimeter strong enough to make dislodging them prohibitively costly, and then present Washington with a choice: accept a negotiated settlement that locks in Japanese gains, or face an open-ended war in a distant ocean at enormous expense. Naval victory was supposed to be the instrument of that strategy, not the end in itself. Sink enough of the Pacific Fleet, hold enough of the perimeter, make the cost of counterattack look prohibitive, and perhaps a war-weary American public and a pragmatic Roosevelt administration would conclude that the price of full reconquest wasn't worth paying. That reframes the question considerably. Japan didn't need to destroy the U.S. Navy forever. It needed to damage it badly enough, and quickly enough, to buy time and political leverage before American industry could close the gap. From this angle, we can actually sketch several distinct victory conditions that a 1941-era Japanese strategist might have recognized as viable. The first is a truly decisive early blow. Not just Pearl Harbor, but something more comprehensive that cripples American naval power for 2 to 3 years rather than 6 months, potentially including the destruction of the carrier fleet and the Pacific Fleet's shore infrastructure. The second is a successful defensive strategy that bleeds the Americans so severely in the central and southwestern Pacific that domestic political pressure forces a compromise peace before the industrial balance becomes overwhelming. The third, more speculative, is that Japan successfully savors American access to Australian basing and resources, isolating whatever remains of Allied power in the Pacific and forcing a negotiated partition of the theatre. These are meaningfully different benchmarks, and they don't all require the same level of naval strength. The first demands outright supremacy in a short window. The second demands resilience and efficiency over a sustained period. The third demands operational reach and strategic audacity. Whether Japan was strong enough depends in part on which of these you're measuring against, and this is exactly why the answer to the question changes depending on what year you're asking about. In late 1941 and early 1942, Japan's relative position was probably at its strongest, certainly stronger than it would ever be again. The American fleet was partially crippled, the carrier balance was close, Japanese aircrew were experienced and well-trained, and American logistics in the Pacific were still catching up. If Japan was ever going to achieve the kind of decisive early blow that its doctrine called for, this narrow window was the moment. Whether it was actually achievable even then is something we'll examine closely. But the relative balance was at least more competitive than at any other point in the war. By mid-1942, the picture is already shifting. American industry is accelerating. The carrier losses at Coral Sea and Midway cannot be replaced at anything like American rates. Japanese aircrew losses are beginning to bite in ways that will not be fully repaired. The window of genuine Japanese naval superiority, if it ever truly existed, is closing. By 1943 and beyond, the question of Japanese naval dominance is essentially answered not in Japan's favour, though the fighting remains ferocious and costly for both sides. This is why throughout this video, the analysis has to be time-sensitive and relative rather than absolute. We're not asking whether Japan had a good navy in some general sense, it clearly did. We're asking whether Japan's navy was strong enough at specific moments and under specific conditions to achieve the strategic outcomes that would have translated naval combat power into a war-winning political result. That's a moving target, and Japan's position against it was always deteriorating faster than most Japanese planners wanted to admit. There's one more layer worth establishing here. Naval strength isn't just about ships and aircraft and trained crews, though all of those matter enormously. It's also about intelligence, logistics, adaptability, and the ability to sustain losses and reconstitute. These are areas where the two navies were not comparable, and where Japan's disadvantages compounded over time in ways that pure tactical skill couldn't offset. With all of that framing in place, let's actually look at what these two navies had on paper, and in practice, when the shooting started, because the raw balance of forces in December 1941 is more complicated and more instructive than the dramatic events of that morning at Pearl Harbor might suggest. So what did these two navies actually look like when war arrived in December 1941? The numbers are familiar to many students of the Pacific War, but they're worth examining carefully, because the raw figures tell a story that's more nuanced than either Japan was hopelessly outmatched or Japan had a serious chance. Start with carriers, since they would prove to be the decisive platform of the entire conflict. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers of various sizes, 6 of which, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, formed the first air fleet, the Kido Butai. This was a genuinely revolutionary concentration of carrier striking power, with no real equivalent in any other navy in the world at that moment. The United States had 7 carriers total, but only 3, Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise, were assigned to the Pacific. Yorktown was in the Atlantic. The arithmetic of carrier strength in the Pacific theatre, at least at the start, genuinely favoured Japan, and not by a small margin. Battleships present a more complicated picture. Japan had 10 in service at the start of the war, with the 2 enormous Yamato-class ships. Yamato herself commissioned just days before Pearl Harbor, representing the largest and most heavily armed battleships ever built. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had 9 battleships, 8 of which were concentrated at Pearl Harbor. This looks roughly comparable on paper, but Japanese battleships were generally newer, faster, and more capable than the aging American vessels that had been designed primarily for coastal defense and fleet engagements in familiar waters. On the other hand, the Yamato's impressive specifications turned out to matter less than anyone expected, for reasons that had more to do with the nature of the war that actually unfolded than any deficiency in the ships themselves, in cruisers and destroyers. The balance was again close enough to be competitive. Japan had roughly 18 heavy cruisers against 11 American heavy cruisers in the Pacific, and both sides had substantial destroyer forces. Japanese destroyers were fast, well-armed, and would prove devastatingly effective in the night surface actions around Guadalcanal. Japanese cruisers carried the Long Lance torpedo, a weapon so far superior in range and reliability to anything the Americans deployed that it amounted to a genuine asymmetric advantage in surface combat. Submarines are worth pausing on, because the contrast here is instructive in a different way. Both navies had large submarine forces. Japan had around 60 fleet submarines available at the start of hostilities. The United States had roughly 55 submarines in the Pacific. By this measure, rough parity. But their doctrine was radically different. Japanese submarines were designed and deployed for fleet warfare, hunting warships, serving as scouts, delivering supplies. American submarines were aimed from relatively early in the war at merchant shipping, Japan's economic lifeline. The implications of that doctrinal difference wouldn't fully materialize until later, but it's worth noting even here that Japan's submarine force, despite its size, was being used in ways that generated far less strategic damage to the enemy than American submarines would eventually inflict on Japan. Naval aviation numbers are where things get genuinely interesting. Japan's carrier-based aircrews in December 1941 were, by almost any measure, the most experienced and capable in the world. Their pilots had been tested in combat over China, refined through intensive training programs, and organized into a coherent striking force that had no real peer. American naval aviation was competent, but less seasoned. The aircraft themselves were roughly comparable in some categories. The Zero fighter was clearly superior to anything the Americans had carrier-based at the start, though American aircraft design would close and then exceed that gap faster than Japan could respond. Then there's geography, which shaped everything. Japan's forward bases across the Caroline Islands, the Marianas, and soon captured territories across Southeast Asia gave the Imperial Navy the advantage of operating near its objectives. American power had to project across the vast distances of the Pacific, from bases in Hawaii, or further still from the continental United States. This wasn't merely a matter of travel time. It affected logistics, repair, reinforcement, and the tempo of operations. Japan could mass and strike relatively quickly in the western and central Pacific. The United States at the beginning was working from a strategic disadvantage of distance that was enormous and real. But here is where the analysis has to be honest about what the raw numbers obscure. Several of the United States' most important advantages in December 1941 were essentially invisible in a conventional force comparison. American shipbuilding capacity was not just larger than Japan's, it was incomparably larger, and it was already beginning to accelerate. The Essex-class carrier program was underway. The industrial mobilization that Pearl Harbor would ignite would eventually produce a navy so large that Japan's entire fleet would look modest by comparison. None of this was on the water yet. None of it showed up in a ship count. But it was real, and it was coming. Readiness and recoverability are also measures of naval strength that simple tallies miss. A ship that is sunk is gone. A ship that is damaged can be repaired. And the United States had a repair and logistics infrastructure in the Pacific, and behind it on the west coast that Japan could not match. Japan's industrial capacity for naval repair and replacement was limited, and would remain so throughout the war. Every ship Japan lost was harder to replace, every aircrew killed was harder to reconstitute, every carrier sunk was a wound that healed slowly, if at all. This is perhaps the most important imbalance of all, and it was baked into the strategic situation before a single shot was fired. Japan's navy was powerful, experienced, and in several respects genuinely superior in the opening phase. In carrier strength, aircrew quality, torpedo technology, night fighting capability, and forward positioning, Japan held real advantages, not illusory ones, not propaganda. But the navy Japan built was optimized for decisive, concentrated, short-duration combat. It was not designed to sustain a prolonged war of attrition against an opponent with vastly greater reserves of industry, manpower, and economic resilience. The question of whether Japan was strong enough to beat the U.S. Pacific Fleet was, from the very beginning, really a question about time, how much of it Japan had, and how quickly American advantages that didn't yet exist on the water in December 1941 would become ones that did. That question of time, and how much Japan actually had, was not an accident. It was the product of decades of treaty negotiations, strategic anxiety, and careful war planning on both sides of the Pacific. To understand why the Japanese Navy was built the way it was, and why it went to war the way it did, you have to go back at least to 1922. The Washington Naval Treaty was, depending on your perspective, either a diplomatic triumph or a slow-motion strategic catastrophe for Japan. Signed in February of that year by the 5 major naval powers, it established capital ship tonnage ratios that locked in American and British superiority over Japan in a formal, legally binding way. The ratio was 5-5, 3 5 tons of American capital ships, 5 British, 3 Japanese. Japan's Navy minister at the time famously called it a humiliation. Some officers who signed the treaty went home and resigned. The sense that Japan had been assigned a permanent second-tier status in its own backyard was not imagined. It was written into international law. The London Naval Treaties of 1930 and 1936 extended and refined these limitations, though by the time the Second London Treaty was being negotiated, Japan had essentially withdrawn from the framework entirely. The whole experience left a deep institutional wound inside the Imperial Navy, a conviction that Western powers, and the United States in particular, intended to keep Japan strategically subordinate, and that the only answer was to find ways to equalize a situation that treaties had made formally unequal. This is where the asymmetric thinking really begins. If you cannot match the enemy in raw tonnage, you find other ways. Superior crew training, better torpedoes, nighttime tactics that reduce the advantage of sheer numbers. You look for a way to neutralize the opponent's quantitative edge before it can be brought to bear. This psychology, call it encirclement anxiety, or strategic inferiority complex, depending on your sympathies, ran deep inside Japanese naval culture by the 1930s. Japan had interests in China, ambitions across East Asia, and a growing dependence on imported oil from the Dutch East Indies and elsewhere. The United States, with its Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor and its treaty commitments to the Philippines, was the obvious obstacle. An American fleet that could project power westward across the Pacific was, from Tokyo's perspective, an existential threat to everything Japan was trying to build. The fear was not paranoid. It was grounded in a genuine understanding of the material balance, and that understanding made Japanese planners nervous enough to do something about it. The American side had its own long tradition of Pacific strategic thinking, and it pointed toward the same confrontation from the opposite direction. War Plan Orange, which the U.S. military had been refining since the early 20th century, anticipated a war against Japan almost exactly as it eventually came. The basic concept was straightforward. Japan attacks American possessions in the Western Pacific, the U.S. Pacific Fleet fights its way westward across the ocean. A decisive fleet engagement somewhere in the Philippine Sea or the Western Pacific settles the question of control. Orange was not a secret document, in the sense that the Japanese didn't understand what it implied. They knew the Americans planned to come west. That shaped everything. What's striking in retrospect is how much both navies planned around the same fundamental idea, a Mahanian decisive fleet engagement, a single climactic battle that would determine mastery of the Pacific. The concept had intellectual roots going back to Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories of sea power, and was reinforced by the example of Tsushima in 1905, where Japan's navy annihilated a Russian fleet in a single concentrated engagement. Both the United States and Japan drew lessons from Tsushima, though they drew somewhat different ones. For Japanese planners, the key was to damage the American fleet severely enough before that westward advance that, when the decisive engagement finally came, the odds would be roughly equal or better. This is the strategic logic behind the Mahon-influenced concept the Japanese called Kantai-Kessen, decisive battle. The idea was to bleed the American fleet through attrition as it crossed the Pacific, using submarines, land-based air power, destroyer torpedo attacks, and surface ambushes to whittle down American strength before the main battle fleets clashed. Then, with numbers equalized, Japan's superior training and fighting quality would carry the day. It was an elegant theory. It was also built on assumptions that would prove catastrophically fragile. For American planners, the calculation was ultimately simpler, if no less demanding. Get the fleet to the Western Pacific, bring Japan to battle, win. The industrial base that supported War Plan Orange's assumptions was real. The United States could absorb losses and keep fighting in ways Japan could not. American planners knew this. Japanese planners also knew this, which is precisely why they needed to win quickly and decisively before American productive capacity could be fully brought to bear. The gap between these two planning traditions, one that counted on time working in its favour, one that desperately needed to prevent that, explains a great deal about how the Pacific War actually unfolded. Japanese strategy was not reckless or unintelligent. It was a rational response to a genuinely difficult strategic problem. If you cannot win a long war of industrial attrition, you must either avoid war entirely or win quickly enough that the enemy's industrial potential never becomes relevant. Japan's leaders understood the risk. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly warned that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year, but had serious doubts about what came after. That is not the statement of a man who believed Japan could beat the United States in a prolonged contest. The tragedy, if that word applies to strategic miscalculation, is that the pre-war planning frameworks on both sides actually identified the right variables. Japan needed to neutralize American strength quickly and force a negotiated settlement before attrition took over. The United States needed to survive the opening phase and mobilize its industrial advantages. What the Japanese plans could not fully account for was how rapidly American technology, doctrine, and production would adapt, and how the very nature of naval warfare would shift away from the battleship-centered decisive engagement both sides had spent decades preparing for. The aircraft carrier changed everything, and not always in the ways either navy expected. By the time the war began, some of the assumptions embedded in 2 decades of planning were already quietly becoming obsolete, though neither side fully understood that yet. So the Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic concept around the idea that quality could compensate for quantity. That wasn't wishful thinking. It was a genuine institutional commitment that produced some of the most capable naval forces in the world in the years leading up to the Pacific War. Whether that commitment was ultimately sufficient is a different question. But dismissing Japanese qualitative advantages as propaganda or self-delusion would be a serious mistake. They were real, they were formidable, and for a period they genuinely worried American commanders in ways that raw tonnage comparisons don't fully capture. Start with the aviators. Japanese naval aviation in 1941 operated on training standards that were extraordinarily demanding by any contemporary measure. Candidates entering the Naval Air Corps faced selection processes so rigorous that completion rates were sometimes frighteningly low. One estimate suggests that in certain pre-war classes, only a fraction of candidates who began training actually reached frontline service. Those who made it through had accumulated flight hours that dwarfed what their American counterparts typically possessed at the same stage. The men who flew at Pearl Harbor, who struck through the Dutch East Indies, who hunted Allied warships across the Indian Ocean in the spring of 1942, were in many cases veterans of the air war over China, with real combat experience layered on top of that intensive technical training. They were not simply well drilled, they were battle-hardened professionals operating at the top of their craft. The surface warfare community was no different in its emphasis on relentless preparation. Japanese cruiser and destroyer crews trained obsessively for night combat, drilling torpedo attacks in darkness until the procedures became essentially reflexive. The doctrine was built around aggression, speed, and the willingness to close with the enemy at ranges where individual seamanship and fighting spirit could matter as much as firepower. American officers who encountered Japanese surface forces in the opening years of the war frequently came away shaken, not because they had expected an incompetent opponent, but because the actual ferocity and skill they encountered exceeded even their respectful estimates. The battles around Guadalcanal would make this uncomfortably clear, but the roots of it ran back years before the first shot was fired. At the center of Japan's surface warfare doctrine sat a weapon that genuinely changed the tactical calculus in the Pacific, the Type 93 torpedo, better known to history as the Long Lance. It is difficult to overstate how far ahead of anything else in the world this weapon was at the time of its introduction. The Long Lance ran on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, which eliminated the telltale wake that betrayed most contemporary torpedoes and dramatically increased its range. It could carry a warhead weighing nearly half a ton to a range of roughly 22 miles at 40 knots, or even farther at reduced speed. American torpedoes of the same period were, by comparison, slower, shorter ranged, less reliable, and, as would be discovered with painful consequences, prone to malfunction in combat conditions. The long lance was not merely a better weapon, it was a different category of weapon, and Japanese destroyer and cruiser tactics were specifically designed to exploit it. The tactical vision underlying all of this was the concept of kantai kessen, decisive battle, but the route to that decisive battle mattered enormously. Japanese doctrine envisioned a sequential campaign of attrition as the American fleet advanced westward across the Pacific. Submarines would strike first at the American formations, ideally disrupting and depleting them before they could reach the western Pacific. Long-range land-based bombers operating from island bases would add to the toll. Then, as American forces drew closer, destroyer flotillas would launch coordinated night torpedo attacks designed to sink capital ships before any exchange of gunfire could occur. The idea was that by the time the American battleships actually engaged the Japanese battle line in the climactic surface engagement, the numerical balance would have been fundamentally altered in Japan's favour. The Americans would arrive already weakened, perhaps badly weakened, and Japanese gunnery superiority, also real, also the product of intensive training, would finish the work. This was not an unreasonable theory given the constraints Japan faced. It represented sophisticated asymmetric thinking, the kind of doctrine you develop when you cannot simply outbuild your adversary, and must therefore find ways to neutralize that adversary's advantages before they become decisive. And there were moments, particularly in the surface battles around the Solomon Islands in 1942 and 1943, where it seemed to be working. The night battles off Savo Island, Tassafaronga, Cape Esperance. These were engagements where Japanese surface forces inflicted embarrassing losses on American ships that, on paper, should not have been so vulnerable. Tassafaronga in particular, where a Japanese destroyer force using long lance torpedoes badly damaged an American cruiser force, despite radar advantages and the element of tactical surprise, read like a case study in what skilled crews with superior weapons could accomplish against numerically comparable opponents. The harder question is whether any of this could ever have been enough. Qualitative advantages are real, but they have inherent limits. Training pipelines require time and infrastructure, and the extraordinarily high standards Japan maintained in its pre-war naval aviation program had a structural weakness built in. They could not be rapidly scaled. When experienced aviators died, replacing them with personnel of comparable skill took years, not months. The Americans, with their larger industrial and educational base, could absorb losses and train replacements faster, even if those replacements initially came out less polished. Japan's qualitative edge was, in a meaningful sense, a finite resource. Every veteran pilot lost at Coral Sea, Midway, or in the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal, was a loss that the system could not quickly repair. The long lance was a genuine advantage in the specific tactical scenario it was designed for, night surface engagements at medium to long range, where its speed and range created lethal opportunities. But the Pacific War was not going to be decided primarily by destroyer torpedo attacks. It was going to be decided by carrier aviation, by submarines, by logistics chains stretching thousands of miles, and ultimately by the productive capacity of two industrial economies. In those competitions, Japan's edge in torpedo design and night fighting doctrine counted for less with every passing month. What Japan had built by 1941 was an instrument of remarkable quality, a navy that could strike with precision and ferocity, that had thought deeply about how to fight at a disadvantage, and that had developed real solutions to real tactical problems. The question was never whether those solutions were genuine. The question was whether they were sufficient for the scale and duration of the war that was actually coming. If Japan's surface warfare doctrine represented one answer to the problem of fighting a stronger enemy, its carrier aviation represented something different entirely. Not just a tactical solution, but a genuine claim to superiority. And that claim, at least for a brief window in 1941 and into 1942, was arguably valid in ways that still reward careful examination. The instrument at the centre of that claim was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, a concentration of fleet carriers that had no real equivalent anywhere in the world when it launched the Pearl Harbor attack. 6 large carriers operating together, their air groups coordinated under unified command, capable of massing strike packages that individual carrier task forces simply could not replicate. This sounds straightforward enough in retrospect, but it was actually a significant organizational and doctrinal achievement. Most navies in 1941, including the United States Navy, still thought of carriers primarily as individual units or operated them in pairs. The idea of concentrating carrier air power into a single strike formation and using it as a fist rather than scattered fingers was not obvious, and Japan had gotten there first. American carrier doctrine at the outbreak of war was genuinely different in emphasis. The U.S. Navy distributed its carriers more broadly, thinking in terms of task forces built around individual ships rather than massed carrier groups. That approach had its own logic. It reduced vulnerability, provided coverage across wider areas, supported the fleet in multiple roles simultaneously, but it meant that American carriers in late 1941 could not yet match the concentrated punch that the Kido Butai could deliver. If the two carrier forces had met in open battle in December 1941, with the Americans unable to concentrate while Japan could, the result is not obvious. That uncertainty matters. The air groups flying from those Japanese carriers were, by most assessments, the finest in the world at that moment. The pilots who conducted the Pearl Harbor strike had been training together for months, specifically for that mission, but their baseline capability ran much deeper than mission-specific preparation. Many of them carried experience from the China War. Their proficiency in horizontal bombing, dive bombing, torpedo attack, and fighter combat reflected years of refinement rather than months, and crucially they functioned as cohesive units, crews who knew each other's tendencies, leaders who trusted their subordinates, wingmen who could anticipate rather than merely react. That kind of organizational cohesion is genuinely difficult to manufacture quickly and genuinely difficult to replace when it is lost. The Zero fighter, which those aviators flew, added another dimension. In early combat across the Pacific and Indian Ocean, it outperformed everything Allied forces could initially put against it. More maneuverable, longer-ranged, and flown by pilots who were in many cases already experienced in its particular strengths and weaknesses. Allied commanders who encountered Zero-equipped Japanese air groups in the opening months of the war frequently described the experience as a shock, not because they had assumed Japanese pilots were amateurs, but because the actual capability gap was larger than pre-war assessments had suggested. The carrier battles of early 1942, the Indian Ocean raid in April, which sent British Eastern Fleet forces into temporary retreat, being perhaps the most dramatic example, gave some credibility to the possibility that Japan had built something genuinely without peer. The deeper question is what all of this tactical excellence actually meant strategically. And here the picture becomes considerably more complicated. Tactical superiority, however real, is not the same as strategic sufficiency. Japan's carrier air groups could strike with stunning effectiveness when they had the initiative, when conditions favoured their methods, and when the full weight of the Kido Butai could be brought to bear. But carrier aviation in 1941 and 1942 was fragile in ways that became clearer only under the pressure of sustained combat. Carrier decks burn. Aircraft are lost in every engagement, not just in disasters. Pilots who die cannot be cycled back into the rotation. The Kido Butai's extraordinary concentration of trained aviators was also, to revisit the theme from the previous section, a finite resource, one that was being spent faster than it could be replenished even in the months before Midway. There is also a reasonable argument that Japan's carrier superiority was more temporal than structural. The United States was not standing still. American carrier doctrine was evolving rapidly. American industry was beginning to accelerate construction, and American training pipelines, less selective, more scalable, were producing large numbers of competent aviators. The window in which the Kido Butai held a decisive qualitative edge over American carrier forces was probably measured in months rather than years, even in the absence of a catastrophic defeat. Midway accelerated the closing of that window dramatically, but the window was already narrowing, which raises the most genuinely interesting counterfactual. Did that temporary superiority represent a real path to defeating the American Pacific Fleet? Some historians have argued that the answer is yes, that a more aggressive follow-up to Pearl Harbor, one that targeted the oil storage facilities and dry docks at Pearl Harbor rather than stopping with the battleships and airfields, might have crippled American Pacific operations for a year or more. Others suggest that destroying the American carriers in a decisive early engagement might have altered the strategic balance long enough for Japan to consolidate its defensive perimeter and negotiate a favourable settlement. The problem with both arguments is that they assume American decision-making would have remained static in response. A more devastating Pearl Harbor, one that eliminated the Pacific Fleet's logistical infrastructure, might well have accelerated American mobilization and industrial conversion rather than producing the despair Japan hoped for. And even destroying 2 or 3 American carriers in a hypothetical early engagement would not have eliminated the construction programs that were already underway. Japan's carrier edge was real, but it existed against an adversary with the capacity to replace losses at a pace Japan simply could not match. What the Kido Butai represented then was something both impressive and ultimately insufficient. A moment of genuine superiority built on years of investment and institutional excellence, capable of striking devastating blows, but incapable of delivering the kind of permanent, irreplaceable damage that might have actually changed the war's trajectory. Japan was briefly, in a meaningful tactical sense, the most dangerous carrier power in the world. Whether that was ever enough to actually beat the United States Pacific Fleet is where the question gets harder to answer with confidence, and where the story takes its decisive turn. That decisive turn begins, of course, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, and understanding what Pearl Harbor actually accomplished versus what it was designed to accomplish gets us closer to the heart of whether Japan ever had a realistic path to winning the naval war it was starting. Japan's strategic aim at Pearl Harbor was not, as it is sometimes described, simply to destroy the American fleet out of spite or desperation. The operation had a specific operational logic. Japanese planners understood that the southern advance, the seizure of Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the resource-rich territories that would sustain Japan's war economy, would expose the Japanese flank to American naval interference. The Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor represented the only force capable of disrupting that advance quickly. The attack was designed to neutralize it long enough for Japan to establish its defensive perimeter, consolidate its gains, and present the United States with a strategic situation costly enough to deter the kind of sustained counteroffensive that could unravel everything Japan had taken. Measured against that specific objective, Pearl Harbor was a substantial operational success. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and American casualties ran to more than 3,500 killed and wounded. The Pacific Fleet's battle line, the instrument American planners had long envisioned as the primary tool for projecting power across the Pacific, was knocked out of the war for months. Japan's southern advance proceeded almost entirely without the interference Pearl Harbor was designed to prevent. But here is where the gap between tactical success and strategic sufficiency opens up, and it opens up quickly. The ships that actually mattered most on December 7th were not in harbour. The 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all at sea, absent through what Japan's planners correctly identified as bad luck rather than anything they could control. Those carriers would go on to fight Coral Sea, to survive the desperate months that followed, and to form the core of the American naval response at Midway. Their survival alone is enough to complicate any simple account of Pearl Harbor as a decisive blow. Equally important, and somewhat less discussed in popular accounts, is what else survived. Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities held approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil, virtually the entire fuel reserve for American Pacific operations. They were left untouched. The dry docks and repair facilities that would allow the United States to salvage, repair, and return damaged ships to service remained intact. The submarine base, from which American submarines would begin their attrition campaign against Japanese shipping almost immediately, was unharmed. Yamamoto, who understood naval logistics better than many of his subordinates, is reported to have grasped this problem clearly. The question of what a different target set might have achieved haunts the operation to this day. Had Japanese aircraft devoted their attack runs to the oil tank farms and the dry docks rather than, or in addition to, the battleships already resting in harbour, the calculus changes considerably. Without fuel reserves, the Pacific Fleet's ability to operate from Pearl Harbor would have been compromised for potentially a year or more. Without repair facilities, even ships that survived the initial attack could not have been returned to service with anything like the speed that actually occurred. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor, which eventually returned most of the damaged battleships to active duty, represents one of the most consequential logistical achievements of the Pacific War. That achievement depended entirely on the facilities remaining available. This brings us to the debate over a third strike, perhaps the most persistently argued tactical question surrounding the operation. After 2 waves of attacks, Vice Admiral Nagumo ordered the Kido Butai to withdraw rather than launching another assault. His reasons were defensible by the operational logic of the moment. His aircraft had accomplished their primary objectives. His ships' positions were known to the Americans. His pilots were fatigued, and the locations of those missing American carriers remained unknown. A surface counterattack, a submarine ambush, or an airstrike from an undamaged carrier finding his force in the afternoon could have turned a triumph into a disaster. Nagumo was not being timid by the standards of his situation. But the case for a third strike, argued convincingly by some of Japan's own officers at the time, and by historians since, rests on exactly the target list we have been discussing. Fuel storage, repair facilities, the submarine base. These were not heavily defended, not likely to be found protected by the missing carriers, and not movable once destroyed. A third strike aimed not at the already damaged battleships, but at the infrastructure keeping the Pacific Fleet functional, might have extended the period of American operational paralysis from months to years. Whether Nagumo had the fuel, the ordnance configuration, and the daylight hours to execute such a strike effectively remains genuinely debated. But the opportunity cost of not trying it was enormous. Measured against the standard we established earlier, what would it actually mean to beat the Pacific Fleet? Pearl Harbor falls short in ways that proved decisive. Beating the Pacific Fleet meant eliminating its capacity to contest the Pacific, not merely damaging its battle line. It meant destroying not just ships, but the ability to replace, repair, and sustain those ships over time. It meant eliminating the carriers that would fight the battles Japan most needed to win. On every one of these dimensions, Pearl Harbor came up short, not because Japanese execution was poor. In many respects the tactical execution was superb, but because the target priorities were misaligned with the strategic goal. There is also a harder question lurking beneath the operational critique, one that uncomfortable to pose but intellectually necessary. Would a more comprehensive attack have produced the strategic outcome Japan wanted, or would it simply have redirected American anger and accelerated American mobilization? A Pearl Harbor that destroyed the fuel tanks and dry docks alongside the battleships would have been a far more devastating blow. It would not have changed the American decision to fight. It would not have eliminated the shipbuilding programs already underway on the mainland. It might have delayed American operations in the Pacific significantly, but delay was never the same as defeat. Pearl Harbor, then, stands as perhaps the clearest early illustration of the gap between what Japan's navy could do and what Japan needed its navy to do. The Kido Butai struck with extraordinary skill, and achieved genuine, lasting damage to American capabilities. It did not, however, break the Pacific Fleet, and the distance between what it achieved and what would have been required to truly neutralize American naval power in the Pacific was, as events would prove, unbridgeable. And yet, whatever Pearl Harbor's ultimate limitations, the 6 months that followed produced results so dramatic that it is easy to understand why the world, and some within Japan's own leadership, began to believe the impossible might actually be happening. From December 1941 through the spring of 1942, Japanese naval and amphibious power swept across an area of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, covering roughly 1/3 of the globe. The Philippines fell, Malaya fell, along with Singapore, which Churchill called the worst British military disaster in history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Burma was overrun. Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Borneo, Celebes, Timor. The list reads like a catalogue of accumulated catastrophe for the Allied powers. Japan's naval forces weren't simply winning individual engagements. They were building an empire, constructing a defensive perimeter of such geographic scale that even a determined adversary would need years and enormous resources just to reach its outer edges. The operational logic behind this expansion was coherent and, in its own way, impressive. Japan's navy wasn't designed purely to fight pitched fleet engagements. It was designed to enable seizure and to defend what was seized. Every island group captured extended that defensive perimeter. Every airfield taken added to Japan's ability to project land-based air power, which Japanese planners trusted, sometimes more than carrier aviation, as the primary tool for defending the empire against eventual counterattack. The advance wasn't reckless. It was methodical, coordinated, and executed by forces that had spent years training for exactly this kind of sustained, wide-ranging offensive action. The Allied defeats during this period weren't merely embarrassing. They were operationally significant in ways that reinforced the impression that the Pacific Fleet had been effectively neutralized. The Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942 is perhaps the starkest example. A combined American, British, Dutch and Australian naval force under Dutch Admiral Carroll Dorman engaged a Japanese invasion convoy and its escorts and was effectively annihilated. Dorman was killed. Most of his ships were sunk within 2 days of fighting. The Japanese landing they were trying to prevent proceeded without meaningful interference. Here was Allied naval power at its most desperate, thrown together from multiple nations, operating with poor communication, inadequate air cover, and no common doctrine, and it was swept aside. Across these months, the Kido Butai itself demonstrated a reach that seemed almost supernatural by the standards of earlier naval warfare. In April 1942, Nagumo's carriers raided Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, sinking the British carrier Hermes, 2 cruisers and a destroyer, while operating deep in the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, outmatched and outranged, was forced to withdraw entirely from the area around Ceylon and retreat to the East African coast. Japan was not merely dominating the Pacific. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it was threatening to sever the connection between Britain and India, raising strategic possibilities that sent genuine alarm through Allied planning circles. So why did it all seem unstoppable? Part of the answer is that Japan was fighting in the window it had planned for. Japanese strategists had never expected to maintain surprise, material advantage, or operational momentum indefinitely. The expansion of the first 6 months was not the result of durable, structural naval superiority. It was the result of a carefully timed peak. Forces concentrated, trained to their highest pitch, operating against opponents who were scattered, shocked, and in several cases still organized around pre-war assumptions about where and how the fighting would occur. Japan had prepared exhaustively for this specific phase. The tragedy, from Japan's perspective, is that this phase was always going to end. Consider what was actually happening beneath the surface of these victories. Japan's pilot cadre, the same elite airmen who had carried the Kido Butai to Pearl Harbor and Ceylon, was being spent in combat operations across an enormous theatre. Unlike the United States, which was already expanding its pilot training infrastructure on a massive scale, Japan had no equivalent pipeline ready to replace experienced aviators at the rate the ongoing offensive demanded. The carriers were accumulating operational wear. The destroyers and cruisers covering amphibious operations were consuming fuel and mechanical life. Every week of brilliant offensive success was a week Japan was drawing down reserves. It lacked the industrial base to replenish at anything approaching American speed. There is also the question of what the offensives failed to accomplish even during their most spectacular phase. Japan seized the resource territories it needed, most critically the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, but the process of actually converting those resources into usable war material and transporting it to Japan was slower and more vulnerable than planners had hoped. Meanwhile, American submarines, operating from the intact base at Pearl Harbor that Nagumo had left undisturbed, were already beginning to probe Japanese shipping lanes. The damage in early 1942 was limited. The direction of travel was not. Perhaps most importantly, the impression that the United States had been strategically neutralized was always somewhat illusory. The Pacific Fleet had been shocked and its battle line damaged, but it had not been broken. Carrier task forces were conducting raids against Japanese positions at Wake Island, Marcus Island, and the Marshalls within weeks of Pearl Harbor. Not decisive operations, but demonstrations that American naval power retained both the will and the capability to reach out and strike. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, launched from the carrier Hornet to bomb Tokyo itself, carried more symbolic weight than physical damage. But symbolism matters in war. Japan's home islands were not inviolable. The protective perimeter had gaps. What the first 6 months represented then was operational momentum rather than sustainable dominance. Japan had seized the initiative so forcefully and exploited it so efficiently that the gap between its apparent strength and its actual structural capacity was temporarily invisible. Victories at this pace and scale generate their own logic. They make the impossible look routine. They encourage the assumption that whatever has worked so far will continue to work. And that assumption, planted during the most dazzling 6 months of Japanese naval history, would shape Japanese strategic decisions at exactly the moment when clear thinking about limits was most urgently needed. The question was never really whether Japan could expand. The question was whether it could hold, replace, and sustain. And the answers to those questions were already being written, quietly and irreversibly, in the shipyards, pilot training schools, and oil reserves of both nations, long before the first shots at Midway changed everything. Those questions about holding, replacing, and sustaining weren't abstract strategic concerns. They had concrete, measurable answers, and almost every one of them pointed in the same direction. Start with oil. Because oil was not merely a logistical variable for Japan. It was the reason the war existed in its current form. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States before the Roosevelt administration began tightening export restrictions in 1940 and 1941. The embargo that followed Japan's deeper incursion into French Indochina in mid-1941 was, in Japanese eyes, an existential provocation. Without imported oil, Japan's navy, the most fuel-hungry element of its entire military apparatus, would run dry within 2 years. The Dutch East Indies, with their rich petroleum reserves, weren't simply a strategic prize. They were the entire logic of southern expansion. Seize the oil and Japan could sustain the war. Lose access to the oil, and the war was already lost regardless of what happened at sea. The problem was that acquiring oil fields and actually delivering usable fuel to the ships and aircraft that needed it were two entirely different challenges. Japan's merchant marine, which carried that oil northward through the Pacific and into home waters, was never well protected in the way the broader war plan required. The tanker fleet was limited in size. The convoy escort system that might have shielded those tankers was inadequate almost from the beginning. Partly because Japan's navy was culturally oriented toward offensive combat power rather than unglamorous defensive escort work. Every barrel of oil that reached Japan from the Dutch East Indies had to survive a sea journey increasingly threatened by American submarines operating out of Pearl Harbor and later from Fremantle in Australia. In the first year of the war, the losses were survivable. Over time, they would become catastrophic, but the structural vulnerability was there from the first day, a long, thin, exposed supply line carrying the one resource without which Japanese naval power literally could not move. Now set oil aside and look at the shipbuilding comparison, because the numbers are almost difficult to process without stopping to reconsider them. The United States, even before the full mobilization of its industrial economy, had a peacetime shipbuilding capacity that substantially exceeded Japan's wartime maximum. American shipyards were spread across both coasts, well supplied with steel, and staffed by an industrial workforce that could be expanded rapidly through training programs, the scale of which Japan simply had no equivalent. When the full weight of American wartime production began to register, between 1943 and 1944, the United States was launching escort carriers, the small, mass-produced carriers used for convoy protection and amphibious support, at a rate that strained comprehension. At peak production, American yards were completing a new escort carrier every week. Fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were coming off the ways in numbers that made Japan's losses not merely replaceable, but, from Washington's perspective, almost manageable. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers before the war and converted several others. It would commission only a handful of new fleet carriers during the war itself. After Midway, the losses in that category could not be made good in any time frame that mattered to the fighting. American yards, meanwhile, were already working on the Essex-class fleet carriers, a class that would eventually produce 24 ships. Japan had nothing comparable in design, nothing comparable in production pipeline, and nothing comparable in the underlying industrial infrastructure required to build and equip such vessels. Aircraft production followed a similar pattern, perhaps even more starkly. Japan produced roughly 65,000 military aircraft across the entire war. The United States produced nearly 300,000. In 1944 alone, American factories built more aircraft than Japan managed across all 6 years of the broader Pacific and China conflicts combined. This wasn't simply a matter of factory floor space. It reflected the depth of American raw material access, the sophistication of American manufacturing methods, and a supplier network that could absorb disruption in ways Japan's more fragile industrial chain could not. And then there is the pilot question, which may be the most consequential single resource limitation Japan faced throughout the war. The aviators who flew from the Kido Butai's decks in December 1941 were genuinely exceptional. They were the product of a pre-war training regime that was extraordinarily demanding, so demanding, in fact, that Japan's naval air arm was producing roughly 100 new carrier-qualified pilots per year in the late 1930s. That was a deliberate policy choice. Concentrate quality in a small, highly trained elite. It produced magnificent aviators. It also produced a pool with almost no depth. The United States, recognizing earlier than Japan did that air warfare was going to be fought at industrial scale, had already begun expanding pilot training in ways that Japan could not replicate. By 1942, American programs were producing thousands of new pilots annually. By 1943, the pipeline was so robust that pilot skill levels were rising even as output increased. Japan's training pipeline, by contrast, contracted under the pressure of combat losses. The same experienced aviators who should have been rotating home to teach new generations were instead kept in the line because there was no one to replace them. When those veterans were finally lost at Coral Sea, at Midway, in the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal's air campaigns, the knowledge and skill they carried went with them permanently. Replacement pilots arrived in frontline units with less training than their predecessors had, flew against opponents who were improving, and suffered even higher losses. It was a cycle with no natural flaw. This is the critical reframing that the surface story of early Japanese victories tends to obscure. Naval strength in a prolonged industrial war cannot be measured simply by what a navy can do at its peak. It has to include what that navy can do after 6 months of hard fighting, after a year, after 2 years. It has to account for what happens when ships are sunk, when planes are lost, when experienced crews are killed. The United States, even before Pearl Harbor, had structured its economy and its training institutions in ways that answered those questions favorably. Japan, for reasons both structural and cultural, had not. Japan built a sprint. The United States built a marathon. And the race was always, from the very beginning, going to be run over a distance that favored the runner who could keep going long after the initial burst of speed had faded. So Japan built the sprint, the finest opening burst of naval offensive power the Pacific had ever seen. But there is another layer to this story that sits underneath the visible numbers of ships and aircraft and oil barrels, and it shaped several of the war's most decisive moments in ways that no amount of Japanese tactical brilliance could overcome. You can have the best trained pilots in the world, the most aggressive surface warfare doctrine, the sharpest torpedo crews operating under cover of darkness, and still lose the battle before the first shot is fired, if your opponent knows where you're going and you don't know that they know. The United States did not win the intelligence war overnight. Breaking enemy codes is painstaking, probabilistic work, less like finding a key to a lock, and more like reconstructing a shattered language from fragments. But American cryptanalysts, working through the signals intelligence machinery that had been quietly developing throughout the 1930s, made extraordinary progress against Japanese naval communications. The effort centered on the system American analysts called JN-25, the primary operational cipher used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was never fully broken in the sense of being transparently readable at all times, but by early 1942, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, under the direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team, were decoding enough Japanese message traffic to build operational pictures that were, at critical moments, genuinely revelatory. What this meant in practical terms was that American commanders were sometimes able to forecast not just the general direction of Japanese operations, but their timing, their objectives, and the composition of the forces involved. Before Coral Sea in May 1942, American intelligence provided enough warning that Admiral Nimitz could position his carriers to intercept a Japanese invasion force threatening Port Moresby. The battle was tactically messy. Both sides made errors, both sides lost ships. But the fundamental fact that American carriers were waiting rather than caught unaware was a direct product of signals intelligence. Japan was not ambushing the United States. In an important sense, the reverse was true. And then came Midway, which we'll examine in depth in the next section, but whose intelligence dimension deserves consideration here in its own right. The Japanese operation against Midway Atoll was conceived in part as a trap, a move designed to lure American carriers into a decisive engagement on Japanese terms, with a massive assault fleet waiting to destroy them. It was, on paper, a sophisticated operational design. In practice, it suffered from a fundamental and fatal flaw. Rochefort's team had worked out the target, worked out the timing, and worked out enough about the Japanese order of battle that Nimitz could position his carriers not as the surprised prey of a Japanese ambush, but as an ambush force themselves. Japan's carefully constructed trap was sprung by a force that already knew the trap was there. The contrast this creates with the earlier narrative of Japanese advantages is worth sitting with for a moment. Throughout the previous section, we traced how Japan had built genuine, measurable superiority in specific tactical domains: night fighting, torpedo technology, carrier aviation. Those advantages were real. They translated into real victories. But tactical skill operates within an operational environment, and if your opponent can shape that environment before the shooting starts, can decide where to concentrate forces, when to commit reserves, which engagement to accept and which to avoid, then tactical skill alone cannot reliably overcome that informational disadvantage. The Japanese warrior might be fierce and well trained, but if his opponent has already read the orders of battle, the element of surprise works in only one direction. Japan was not unaware that communication security was a concern. There were periodic reviews of cipher systems, occasional alarms that prompted procedural changes. But the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered from an institutional assumption that their codes were simply too complex for foreign analysts to penetrate with any operational usefulness. This confidence was not entirely unreasonable. Breaking JN-25 was genuinely difficult, and American analysts never had complete real-time visibility into Japanese intentions. But partial penetration was enough. Even fragmented, probabilistic intelligence, the kind that tells you a major operation is coming toward objective AF without spelling out every detail, creates asymmetric advantages. It allows the defender to hedge, to concentrate, to refuse the engagements that look unfavourable, and accept those that don't. Could Japan have compensated for these intelligence leaks through different security practices? Almost certainly to some degree. More frequent cipher changes, tighter communications discipline, less reliance on radio traffic that could be intercepted and analysed, all of these would have degraded American code-breaking efforts. The problem is that modern naval operations at the scale Japan was conducting them require communication. Coordinating task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean, synchronizing carrier air operations with surface strike elements, directing supply convoys and submarine patrols, all of this generated radio traffic that was, by its nature, potentially interceptable. Perfect communications, security, and effective operational coordination are, in practice, in tension with each other. Japan could have made code-breaking harder. It probably could not have made it impossible. There is also a deeper issue here, which is the asymmetry in how each side processed and acted on intelligence information. The United States was building an intelligence infrastructure that grew steadily more sophisticated, more analysts, better equipment, improved methods, a willingness to invest in the unglamorous work of signals exploitation. Japan's approach to intelligence was generally less systematic, more dependent on individual expertise, and less well integrated into operational planning at the highest levels. Even when Japanese intelligence suggested something was wrong, when signals, discipline, irregularities, or unexpected American behavior pointed toward the possibility that their plans had been compromised, the institutional response was too often to explain away the anomaly rather than reconsider the plan. The confidence that had propelled Japan's opening offensive became, in the intelligence domain, a kind of selective blindness. What all of this reveals is something that doesn't show up in the comparative fleet tables or the tonnage charts. Naval power is not purely a physical phenomenon. It has an informational dimension. The degree to which a force understands its environment, anticipates its opponent's moves, and denies its opponent the same understanding. In that dimension, the United States was accumulating advantages that would prove just as consequential as any number of new carriers rolling down a shipway. Japan was fighting a battle it could see. The United States was increasingly fighting the battle behind the battle, the one conducted in windowless rooms, over captured codebooks and frequency analyses, in a war of knowledge that its opponent didn't even fully realize was being waged. And nowhere would the consequences of that hidden contest become more visible than at a small atoll in the Central Pacific in the first days of June 1942. Midway sits at the center of almost every serious discussion of the Pacific War, and for good reason, but the way it gets discussed sometimes flattens it into a story of pure luck, a few bombs dropping on flight decks at the perfect moment, turning the tide in an afternoon. That framing contains a grain of truth and obscures something more important. What happened at Midway was the convergence of structural problems that had been present in Japanese strategic planning from the beginning, a code-breaking triumph that was months in the making, and a set of tactical decisions that, once made, left almost no margin for recovery. To understand why the question of whether Japan could beat the Pacific Fleet looks fundamentally different after June 1942 than it did before, you have to look at all three layers. Japan's plan for Midway was, on paper, ambitious in the way that Japanese operational planning tended to be ambitious, layered, multi-axis, designed to achieve several objectives simultaneously. The core logic was to seize Midway Atoll, forcing the United States to respond with its remaining carriers, which would then be destroyed in a decisive engagement by the waiting Japanese fleet. Admiral Yamamoto would finish what Pearl Harbor had left incomplete. The assumption behind the plan was that American carriers would appear roughly where Japanese planners expected them, roughly when they expected them, and without significant advance warning. The trap would work because the prey would walk into it. That assumption was wrong in almost every important respect. Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had reconstructed enough of the Japanese operational plan, target, timing, general force composition, that Nimitz knew a major operation was coming toward Midway weeks before it arrived. Rather than stumbling into an ambush, he positioned his 3 available carriers in a location the Japanese didn't anticipate, under orders to strike first. The hunters became the hunted before the first aircraft left the deck. But code-breaking alone doesn't explain everything that followed. The Japanese operation compounded its intelligence vulnerability with planning problems that were structural. Yamamoto dispersed his forces across multiple task groups, separated by hundreds of miles, hoping to create tactical flexibility, but instead creating coordination problems that proved fatal under pressure. A scouting failure, a catapult malfunction that delayed a crucial reconnaissance flight from the cruiser Tone by 30 minutes, meant the Japanese carrier force was well into its attack on Midway's island facilities before it received confirmed word that American carriers were in the area. When that word arrived, the decision about what to do next set the sequence in motion that every account of the battle returns to, whether to rearm aircraft with anti-ship weapons or continue preparations for a second land attack, with the decks crowded with munitions and fueled planes in what became a catastrophic vulnerability. The counterfactuals cluster around exactly these moments. What if the Tone's scout had launched on time? What if a different rearming decision had been made sooner? What if the Japanese carriers had been able to get their strike aircraft airborne before American dive bombers arrived? These are not frivolous questions, and it would be dishonest to dismiss them. Earlier scouting could have changed the decision calculus significantly. A quicker response to the carrier contact report might have cleared the flight decks before the fatal dive. In a narrow technical sense, the margin between the battle that happened and a very different one was smaller than the result suggests. But here is the more uncomfortable question. Even if Japan had made better decisions at Midway, would the underlying equation have actually changed? The United States still had its code-breaking advantage, still had its industrial capacity, still had the structural ability to replace losses that Japan lacked. A Japanese tactical victory at Midway, sinking 1 or 2 American carriers while preserving the Kido Butai, would have been a significant setback for the United States. It would not have altered the long-term production differential, and it would not have eliminated American code-breaking, though it might have delayed some operations. The window during which Japan had any realistic prospect of forcing a negotiated settlement on favourable terms was probably already closing by June 1942, driven by factors that had nothing to do with which aircraft happened to be on which flight deck at a particular moment. What Midway did was close it faster, and in a way that exposed just how fragile Japan's advantages had always been. The carrier losses, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all 4 sunk within 2 days, were devastating not simply as platform losses, as painful as that was, but because of what the carriers represented in terms of human capital. The veteran aviators of the Kido Butai were among the most thoroughly trained naval airmen in the world. Japan had spent years producing them, running them through a selection and training process, so demanding that the pipeline produced relatively few qualified pilots per year, losing those men, not all of them, but enough, including experienced section leaders and dive bomber crews who went down with their aircraft or failed to survive the ocean, created a gap that Japan's training infrastructure was genuinely ill-equipped to fill quickly. The United States, with its larger population, greater industrial base, and an expanding training program could and did replace aircrew losses at a pace Japan could not match. This asymmetry would become increasingly visible over the following 2 years, but its roots ran directly through the waters northeast of Midway Atoll. So did Midway destroy Japan's chance to beat the Pacific Fleet, or did it merely reveal how narrow that chance had always been? The honest answer is probably both, depending on how strictly you define the question. If there was a version of the war in which Japan could have forced terms favourable enough to justify the gamble, which requires the destruction of American carrier power before American industry made such destruction essentially irreversible, that version required a string of favourable outcomes that Midway foreclosed. In that sense, Midway was decisive, but the structural conditions that made Midway possible, the intelligence asymmetry, the planning overconfidence, the training pipeline limits, the industrial gap, were not created at Midway. They were present before the battle began. What June 1942 did was translate those structural conditions into irreversible material losses, and it did so publicly enough that the shape of the entire war began to look different from that moment forward. The question that had once been whether Japan could administer a blow decisive enough to force an American withdrawal was quietly replaced by a different question entirely. How long could Japan absorb what was now coming? If Midway changed the question, Guadalcanal changed the terrain on which that question would be answered. After the carrier losses in June 1942, the war Japan had originally designed, the swift, decisive series of engagements that would exhaust American will before American industry could fully mobilize, was no longer available. What replaced it was something Japan's strategists had specifically tried to avoid: a grinding months-long campaign of reinforcement, resupply, and incremental attrition, fought out across a chain of islands and a stretch of open ocean that consumed ships, aircraft, and trained men at a rate Japan was structurally incapable of sustaining. The Americans landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942. What followed was not a clean campaign with a decisive moment of resolution. It was more like a siege conducted from both sides simultaneously, each nation trying to feed enough men and material onto or around a jungle island to tip a balance that kept resetting itself, while the other tried to cut those supply lines and tip it back. For Japan, the initial instinct was to treat Guadalcanal as a temporary setback, something that could be corrected with a sharp counterstroke, the kind of violent tactical response that had worked repeatedly in the opening months of the war. That instinct was not entirely unreasonable, given recent history. What proved fatal was how long it took to recognize that sharp counterstrokes were no longer the relevant instrument. The naval battles around Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943 represent one of the most intense periods of surface warfare in the entire conflict, and they force a distinction that gets lost when the Pacific War is told primarily as a carrier story. Japan could, and repeatedly did, win tactical engagements in those waters. The Battle of Savo Island, fought just days after the initial American landings, was a remarkable demonstration of exactly what Japanese night-fighting doctrine could accomplish: a cruiser force manoeuvring in darkness, guided by training and preparation, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers with minimal losses to itself. It was the kind of result that 6 months earlier might have defined a campaign. At Guadalcanal, it barely slowed the momentum. That gap between tactical success and strategic progress is the central fact of the naval war around Guadalcanal. Japan won individual engagements at Cape Esperance, at Tassafaronga, in engagements where its destroyer and cruiser forces handled American counterparts with considerable skill. At Tassafaronga in November 1942, a Japanese destroyer force running a supply mission managed to sink 1 American cruiser and cripple 3 others despite being surprised and outnumbered in terms of firepower. The night fighting capability that had defined Japanese tactical advantage remained real and dangerous well into 1943. The problem was that winning these engagements did not translate into holding Henderson Field, did not translate into cutting American supply lines, and did not bring Japan any closer to reversing the fundamental situation on the island. What it did do was accelerate the erosion of assets Japan could not replace. The carrier battles of August and October 1942, Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, were particularly costly in ways the raw exchange rates don't fully capture. At Santa Cruz, Japan sank the carrier Hornet and heavily damaged the Enterprise, which looked on paper like a meaningful tactical success. But the aircrew losses Japan absorbed in achieving that result were devastating. The pilots who didn't come back from Santa Cruz were not interchangeable with the men who had flown from Shokaku and Zuikaku in December 1941. They were the product of years of selective training, men who had accumulated combat experience across the entire opening arc of the war. Japan's training pipeline had never been sized to produce replacement airmen at the pace the air battles of 1942 were demanding. The United States had already begun expanding its pilot training programs on a scale that Japan couldn't match. Every experienced Japanese aviator lost over Guadalcanal represented a compounding debt that would come due in the carrier battles of 1944. Then there was what the Japanese called the Tokyo Express. The destroyer runs down the slot, the narrow waters of the Central Solomons that became Japan's primary method of getting supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal. This approach was tactically ingenious and strategically ruinous. Destroyers were not transports. They could carry men and a limited quantity of supplies in drums dropped offshore for troops to collect under fire, but they couldn't sustain a serious ground campaign against an enemy that was using the captured airstrip to project air power during daylight hours. Japan lost destroyer after destroyer on these runs to American aircraft operating from Henderson Field, to torpedo attacks, to the accumulating operational costs of sustained high-tempo operations over months. These were not capital ships, but destroyers were not easily replaced either, and more importantly, the missions themselves were not working. Japan was bleeding its surface forces in an effort to sustain a position it could never quite make decisive. The logic of Guadalcanal exposed a contradiction at the heart of Japanese naval strategy that Midway had cracked open but not fully revealed. Japan's entire planning framework had been built around the concept of a decisive battle, a concentrated, violent engagement that would settle the question of Pacific dominance in a short time frame. Attrition was not part of the model. It couldn't be because Japan's industrial capacity, its fuel reserves, its training pipelines, and its shipbuilding rates all meant that a long war of exchange was a war Japan would lose. The original plan had recognized this. What it had failed to adequately account for was what happened if that decisive engagement never arrived on the terms Japan needed, and the war became, instead, exactly this kind of grinding campaign. By the time Japan finally evacuated its forces from Guadalcanal in early February 1943, in what was itself a skillfully executed withdrawal, the campaign had consumed 2 fleet carriers worth of air power, a significant fraction of Japan's heavy cruiser strength, more than 20 destroyers, and an irreplaceable cohort of naval aviators. The United States had absorbed comparable losses in some categories and rebuilt. Japan had not. The 6-month struggle for a single island had done something that no individual battle could accomplish cleanly. It had transformed the theoretical limits of Japanese naval power into actual measurable, unrecoverable deficits. The war of attrition that Japanese planners had feared from the beginning had arrived, and it had arrived before Japan had achieved any of the conditions that might have made it survivable, given what Guadalcanal revealed. The structural mismatch between what Japan needed strategically and what it was capable of sustaining industrially. It's almost impossible to spend time with this history without eventually asking the question that haunts every serious study of the Pacific War. Could Japan have done better? Could different decisions, at key moments, have produced a different outcome? The question deserves honest engagement, not because the answer is obviously yes, but because sorting the plausible from the fantastical tells us something important about where Japan's real constraints actually lived. Start with the most frequently cited what if. Pearl Harbor. The argument goes that Yamamoto's strike force, having achieved surprise and devastated the battleship Roe, should have launched a third strike aimed at the fuel storage facilities, the dry docks, and the submarine pens. Destroy those, and the US Pacific Fleet loses its ability to operate from Hawaii at all, potentially pushing American naval power back to the West Coast and buying Japan months of additional freedom. This argument has a surface plausibility, and some of the Japanese aviators involved have echoed it in post-war accounts. But look harder and the case becomes complicated. A third strike would have been launched into a fully alerted defence against targets that were dispersed and partially protected by air crews already fatigued from 2 waves of attacks. The fuel tanks were large and difficult to destroy comprehensively, and even a successful strike on the infrastructure would not have sunk the carriers, Enterprise, Lexington and Saratoga, that were all at sea that day. The ships that actually determined the first year of Pacific naval warfare would have remained intact. So Pearl Harbor's third strike might have imposed additional costs and delays. Whether it changes the ultimate trajectory is a much harder sell. The Midway question is more interesting and genuinely more debatable. Japan's decision to divide its forces across multiple simultaneous operations, attacking the Aleutians as a diversionary effort, while committing the main fleet to Midway, dispersed strength that might have been concentrated. More importantly, the operational security failures that allowed American codebreakers to anticipate the target and timing of the attack were not inevitable. A Japan that had changed its naval codes after Coral Sea, as some officers apparently recommended, might have approached Midway with the element of surprise restored, or at least without the catastrophic disadvantage of being anticipated. But here's the honest assessment. Even winning at Midway, even destroying the American carrier force, doesn't end the war or permanently resolve the balance of power. American shipyards were already producing Essex-class carriers. The industrial tide would still have come in. Midway's significance is that it accelerated Japan's decline and foreclosed options that were already narrowing. Winning it might have bought time, perhaps significant time, but the underlying arithmetic of the war would have reasserted itself. The more structurally interesting alternative is the one that gets less attention in popular discussions. What if Japan had pursued a genuinely defensive maritime strategy after its initial conquests? By mid-1942, Japan controlled an enormous perimeter, the resource zones of Southeast Asia, the islands of the Central and Southwest Pacific, a network of bases that, if properly defended and mutually supporting, might have presented the United States with a costly, attritional problem rather than a series of exploitable gaps. The forward offensive impulse that drove operations like Midway and the push toward Port Moresby consumed resources and exposed fleets to risk that a more patient defensive posture might have avoided. A Japan that consolidated its perimeter in 1942, fortified it deeply, and forced the United States to pay in blood and time for every inch of advance might not have won. But it might have raised the cost of victory high enough to create genuine political pressure in Washington for a negotiated settlement, which is what Japanese strategy had theoretically been aiming for all along. The submarine question is related and equally underexplored. Japan operated a submarine force that was, in some technical respects, capable. Its submarines had long range, skilled crews, and effective torpedoes. But Japanese submarine doctrine consistently prioritized fleet warfare, hunting American warships, rather than the commerce raiding campaign against American supply lines that might have genuinely degraded the US ability to project power across the Pacific. The United States proved, with devastating effect, that unrestricted submarine warfare against an island nation dependent on maritime supply was a war-winning strategy. Japan attempted nothing comparable at scale. A sustained Japanese campaign against American logistics chains in the Pacific, targeting the supply vessels and tankers feeding operations across thousands of miles of ocean, might not have won the war, but could have complicated and slowed the American advance in ways that the actual Japanese submarine campaign never achieved. None of this should be mistaken for a suggestion that Japan could have engineered its way to victory with the right sequence of decisions. The more carefully you examine the alternatives, the clearer it becomes that most of them fall into the category of delay rather than reversal. The United States was producing ships, aircraft, and trained personnel at rates Japan could not match, and that gap widened with every passing month. A Japanese strategic victory in the narrow sense, destroying or neutralizing the Pacific Fleet decisively enough to force a negotiated peace on favorable terms, required achieving that result before American industry fully mobilized. That window was short, arguably it was never truly open, and it was certainly closed by late 1942, regardless of which specific decisions had been made along the way. What better decisions might genuinely have changed is the cost that the United States paid to win and the timeline over which it paid. A Japan that avoided the Midway disaster, that pursued a more coherent defensive strategy, that invested more heavily in pilot training and logistics, rather than in spectacular offensive operations, might have imposed a significantly longer and bloodier campaign on American forces. Whether that translated into a different political outcome is a question about American will and patience as much as Japanese capability, and that question has no clean answer. The honest conclusion is that Japan's leadership made real errors, some of which were avoidable. But those errors were layered on top of structural disadvantages that no decision tree fully eliminates. Better decisions, at best, might have changed the shape of the defeat. Whether they could have changed the fact of it is where the what-if slides, from plausible alternative into something closer to wishful reconstruction. The decisions mattered. They just didn't matter enough to rewrite the underlying mathematics. If better decisions might have changed the shape of Japan's defeat, without changing its ultimate direction, the deeper reason for that lives in something structural, something that goes beyond any single choice at any single moment. What separated the two navies over the course of the war wasn't just industrial capacity, though that mattered enormously. It was the ability to learn, to absorb punishment, identify failures, revise assumptions, and come back differently. The United States Navy, whatever its early weaknesses, proved to be a remarkably adaptive institution. Japan's Navy, whatever its early strengths, largely was not. And in a war that lasted years and demanded constant evolution, that difference became as decisive as any weapon system. Start with the pilots, because nothing illustrates the contrast more starkly. Japan opened the Pacific War with an aviator corps that was genuinely elite, men who had been forged through years of grueling selection, extensive combat experience over China, and a training philosophy that prized individual excellence above almost everything else. The problem was the math hidden inside that philosophy. Producing one of these pilots took a very long time. The system was optimized for quality, but quality without throughput becomes a fragile asset. The moment losses start to accumulate, when those elite pilots died at Coral Sea, at Midway, in the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal, Japan had no rapid mechanism for replacing them. The training pipeline was simply not built for replacement at scale. Japan did attempt to expand pilot training as the war progressed, but it did so late with insufficient fuel to support adequate flight hours, and against an institutional culture that struggled to accept that good enough might need to replace excellent when excellent was no longer available in sufficient numbers. The American approach looked much less impressive on paper in 1941. But the United States had built a training system that could scale. Programs like the Naval Aviation Cadet Program expanded rapidly, processing thousands of pilots through a structured curriculum that emphasized standardized technique and accelerated competency rather than extended individual refinement. American pilots in 1942 were not individually as battle-hardened as their Japanese counterparts. But there were more of them. More were arriving every month, and the system that produced them could be adjusted and accelerated in ways Japan's could not. By 1943, American pilot quality was closing the gap. By 1944, the veterans in U.S. cockpits had accumulated their own substantial combat experience. while Japan was increasingly sending undertrained replacements into engagements that required everything the original elite had possessed. The pattern repeated itself in technology and doctrine. American radar development is a case study in institutional learning applied to combat conditions. Early American radar sets were crude, unreliable, and imperfectly integrated into tactical decision-making. The Navy identified those failures and drove solutions with urgency, improving hardware, yes, but more importantly developing the Combat Information Center concept that made radar data actionable in real time during complex engagements. By 1943, American surface forces were fighting night battles with a systematic advantage that Japan had once held through superior training and night optics. Japan had invested in radar technology as well, but more slowly, more reluctantly, and with less effective integration into the tactical culture of commanders who had built their confidence on human skill rather than electronic assistance. The night battles that Japan had once dominated began going differently as the tools and doctrines shifted. Damage control tells a related story. American ships early in the war were sunk or badly damaged by fires and flooding that might have been survivable with better trained crews and better shipboard organization. The Navy studied those losses with a systematic rigor that was genuinely impressive, dissecting what had gone wrong, identifying which procedures had failed, and then driving corrected methods throughout the fleet with the kind of institutional urgency that only comes when leadership takes learning seriously as a combat function. Damage control schools expanded. Ships were reworked. The result was a fleet that became measurably harder to sink as the war progressed, not because American ships were inherently more durable, but because the people aboard them had become better at keeping them alive under punishment. Logistics is where American adaptation perhaps achieved its most strategically consequential expression. The development of the Mobile Logistics Force, the fleet trains that followed the fast carrier task forces across the Pacific, replenishing fuel, ammunition, and aircraft at sea, and enabling sustained operations across enormous distances without returning to fixed bases, represented a fundamental reconception of what a navy could do operationally. This wasn't simply a matter of having more resources than Japan, though that was real. It was a doctrinal and organizational innovation that changed what those resources could achieve. Japan had never built its operational planning around this kind of sustained, mobile logistical support. American task forces, by contrast, became capable of operating at range and at tempo in ways that made the fixed base assumptions of pre-war naval doctrine obsolete. Japan's difficulties ran deeper than technology and training. The institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy made systematic learning under pressure genuinely difficult. Failures were rarely analyzed with the kind of clinical honesty that improvement requires. The institutional face-saving pressures that distorted battle reports meant that lessons sometimes went unlearned because the failures that contained them went unacknowledged. The inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army imposed its own costs, creating persistent failures of coordination and resource prioritization that no single decision-maker had either the authority or the incentive to resolve. And the Navy's strategic culture retained its commitment to the decisive fleet engagement, the Mahanian showdown it had trained for, even as the actual war was demanding flexibility, patience, and a capacity for attrition that the institution was not built to sustain. There's a tendency to think of naval power as something that exists at a fixed point. You count the ships, you assess the crews, you estimate the outcome. But the Pacific War demonstrated that naval strength is more dynamic than that. It depends not just on what a force brings to the opening engagement, but on what it learns from the engagements that follow, and how quickly and how thoroughly those lessons become operational reality throughout the fleet. Japan's Navy was genuinely formidable in 1941. In several important respects, it was the most skilled and capable naval force in the Pacific at the moment war began. But it was formidable in ways that were difficult to replenish and difficult to revise. The United States built a navy that got better at being a navy while the war was being fought. That asymmetry, in adaptability, in institutional learning, in the capacity to absorb failure and come back changed, may ultimately be the most complete answer to why the balance shifted as decisively as it did. By 1944, the asymmetry in learning and adaptation that had been building since Midway arrived at its most visible, most devastating expression. 2 battles separated by just a few months, the Philippine Sea in June and Leyte Gulf in October, didn't just confirm that Japan was losing the naval war. They demonstrated something more specific and more sobering, that the gap between possessing a navy and being able to use one effectively had grown so wide that the question of victory had been replaced by a different question entirely. Not whether Japan could win, but whether it could still meaningfully resist. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is remembered by American aviators with a certain dark humour. They called it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot, and the nickname tells you almost everything about what happened to Japanese naval aviation that day. Japan committed 9 carriers to the engagement, along with hundreds of aircraft and crews. On paper, it was a serious force. In practice, it was something closer to a demonstration of how thoroughly the training and experience gap had opened. American Hellcat pilots, flying from a fast carrier task force that had accumulated genuine combat seasoning and benefited from radar-directed fighter direction that Japan simply could not match, tore through successive Japanese strike waves with a lopsidedness that was almost difficult to comprehend. Japan lost somewhere in the neighbourhood of 300 aircraft in a single day. The crews who flew those planes were not the elite of 1941 and 1942. They were replacements produced under a training system that had never solved the throughput problem, men who had received far fewer flight hours than the situation demanded, flying complex combat missions against opponents who had spent years learning exactly how to kill them. The carrier strikes that Japan launched that day required crossing significant distances, attacking a well-defended force with degraded coordination, and executing tactics that demanded the kind of instinctive, experienced judgment that only genuine combat time develops. The results reflected all of those deficiencies at once. Fuel shortages had constrained training. Losses in the preceding 2 years had consumed the irreplaceable core of experienced airmen. And the tactical doctrine Japan relied on, land-based aircraft coordinating with carrier strikes to extend range and multiply pressure, depended on those land-based aircraft actually surviving long enough to participate, which American pre-battle strikes largely prevented. The plan was ambitious. The execution revealed a force that no longer had the human capital to match its own ambitions. 2 Japanese fleet carriers were also sunk that day, largely by American submarines, stripping the mobile force of assets it could not replace in any meaningful time frame. What made the Philippine Sea so analytically significant wasn't just the scale of the loss. It was what the loss revealed about the relationship between Japanese ship strength and Japanese combat power. The carriers existed. The planes existed. On a ledger sheet, Japan could still project something resembling a carrier-striking force. But the effectiveness of that force had collapsed inward, because the people required to operate it at a competitive level had been spent in the attrition of 2 years, and could not be regenerated fast enough, or with enough flying hours, to matter against what American task forces had become. Leyte Gulf, 4 months later, showed a different face of the same underlying reality. Japan's response to the American landings in the Philippines was genuinely bold, operationally creative in ways that deserve acknowledgement even in defeat. The plan split Japanese forces into multiple converging groups designed to draw away American carriers with a decoy force, while surface warships, including the massive battleship Yamato, drove through the Philippine archipelago to attack the invasion fleet. It was a complex, high-risk operation that reflected a willingness to accept losses in exchange for the possibility of a decisive blow. In that sense, the fighting spirit that had characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the war was still present. But boldness and effective combat power are not the same thing, and Leyte Gulf exposed the distance between them with painful clarity. Fuel shortages were so severe that portions of the Japanese fleet sortied from their home bases rather than a forward staging area, meaning some ships arrived at the engagement with critically limited fuel for maneuvering or withdrawal. Command was fragmented across multiple admirals with imperfect communication and conflicting assessments of what was happening as the battle unfolded. The decoy force worked. American carriers did give chase, but the surface force that was supposed to exploit that window hesitated at a critical moment, with its commander making a controversial decision to turn back just as opportunity seemed to open. Whether that hesitation reflected caution, confusion about the tactical situation, or a rational assessment that the costs had become prohibitive is something historians have debated ever since. What is clear is that the moment passed. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers across the several engagements that constituted Leyte Gulf. It was the largest naval battle in history by tonnage and by the breadth of forces involved, and it effectively ended Japan's capacity to conduct fleet operations of any scale. The ships that survived had, in many cases, insufficient fuel to operate regularly. The carrier air groups that might have supported future operations barely existed in functional form. What remained was a navy that could still threaten kamikaze tactics, submarine operations, the occasional surface sortie, but could no longer contest American control of the Western Pacific in any conventional sense. That distinction matters. Japan's navy didn't disappear after Leyte Gulf. Ships remained. The threat they posed required continued American vigilance. But the nature of Japanese resistance had fundamentally changed from a force capable of fleet engagement to a force capable only of imposing costs on an adversary that had already achieved strategic dominance. The question that had animated so much of the preceding 3 years, whether Japan possessed the naval power to defeat the United States in the Pacific, had been answered so completely that it had ceased to be a useful question. What remained was a different calculation: how much the United States would need to pay to finish what Midway had begun and what Philippine Sea had confirmed. Japan's navy in 1944 was no longer a competitor in the strategic contest. It had become an obstacle, formidable in places, dangerous in specific moments, but no longer capable of reversing or even seriously complicating the direction of the war. What makes the Japanese naval leadership's inner calculus so historically fascinating is that they understood many of these limitations before the war even started. The gap between what they said publicly, what they wrote privately, and what they actually planned around reveals a strategic psychology that was neither blindly optimistic nor honestly pessimistic. It occupied a stranger, more uncomfortable space in between. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and arguably the most clear-eyed senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, made his doubts known in terms that should have given pause to anyone listening. His famous statement that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months or a year, but had no confidence in the 2nd or 3rd year, was not a casual aside. It was a considered assessment from the man who had lived in the United States, observed its industrial capacity first-hand, and understood viscerally what a fully mobilized American economy would eventually bring to bear. Yamamoto did not believe Japan could defeat the United States in a prolonged war. He believed Japan might be able to hurt the United States badly enough, quickly enough, that Washington would choose a negotiated settlement over the costs of full reconquest. That is a profoundly different goal from victory, and recognizing that distinction tells you something essential about what Japanese leaders thought they were actually attempting. The strategic logic was never about breaking American power. It was about breaking American will. Japan's planners hoped to establish such a deep defensive perimeter across the Pacific, anchored by island fortresses, supported by a mobile fleet capable of punishing any penetration, that the United States would calculate that the price of forcing that perimeter was higher than the value of whatever lay beyond it. The southern resource zone, secured quickly, would give Japan the oil and raw materials to sustain a genuine empire. The fortified perimeter would impose attrition on any American counteroffensive. And eventually, the argument went, American public opinion would tire of the blood and treasure required, and accept a negotiated outcome that left Japan in possession of its gains. It was a strategy built on political assumptions about American psychology, rather than military assumptions about American capability, and those assumptions were, at best, poorly tested. What is striking reading through the diaries and planning documents that survived the war is how honestly some officers articulated the danger while simultaneously endorsing the gamble. Vice Admiral Onishi Takijiro, who would later become one of the architects of the kamikaze program, expressed deep reservations about the war's prospects even before it began. He was not alone. The Navy's own war games conducted in the autumn of 1941 consistently produced outcomes unfavourable to Japan over extended timelines. Senior planners saw the results. They went ahead anyway, which raises a question that historians have turned over repeatedly. Did they believe the war games were wrong, or did they believe that the alternative, accepting American diplomatic pressure and withdrawing from China, was politically and institutionally impossible regardless of what the models showed? The honest answer seems to be some complicated mixture of both. There was genuine confidence in Japanese tactical superiority, in the quality of the Zero, the skill of their naval aviators, the effectiveness of the long-lance torpedo, the ferocity and discipline of their surface warfare doctrine. That confidence was not invented, it was earned, and there was a corresponding hope, perhaps more hope than calculation, that tactical advantages could somehow be leveraged into a strategic outcome that the underlying numbers did not support. The Navy's leadership knew that Japan produced roughly 1/10 of the steel the United States did annually. They knew the shipbuilding capacity comparison was similarly lopsided. What they chose to believe, or chose to act as if they believed, was that quality and initiative and warrior spirit could bridge a gap that arithmetic said could not be bridged. This tension appears with almost painful clarity in the planning assumptions surrounding the operations of 1942. After Pearl Harbor, there was a genuine divergence within Japanese naval leadership about where to strike next and what the strikes were meant to accomplish. Some officers pushed for an invasion of Hawaii to complete what Pearl Harbor had left unfinished, to eliminate the American carrier fleet and deny the United States its Central Pacific base. Others argued for expanding into the Indian Ocean, severing British supply lines, and potentially linking with German forces pushing through the Middle East. The strategy that actually emerged, the Midway operation combined with a push into the Solomons, reflected a compromise between competing visions, and more importantly, it reflected a growing belief that the decisive battle Yamamoto craved was slipping away with every month the American fleet was allowed to recover and rebuild. There was urgency driving Japanese planning in early 1942, and that urgency itself betrays an awareness that the window of Japanese naval superiority was temporary and narrowing. What none of the planning documents adequately grappled with was the replacement problem in human terms. Japanese naval aviation doctrine had produced a small number of exceptionally skilled airmen by filtering out all but the most talented through an extraordinarily demanding training pipeline. That system worked brilliantly for a navy that expected a short, violent, decisive war. It was catastrophic for a navy that found itself instead in a grinding, multi-year contest of attrition. The loss of experienced aviators at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons campaigns drained a reservoir that could not be refilled. Not because Japan lacked young men willing to fly, but because the training system had never been designed to produce pilots at the volume a prolonged war demanded. Some officers understood this clearly. Admiral Ugaki Matome, whose diaries survived the war and became one of the most valuable primary sources for understanding Japanese naval thinking, recorded his mounting anxiety about aircrew quality with a candour that suggests he knew, by late 1942, that the trajectory was unfavourable. What Japanese leaders actually believed in the end was probably this, that they were taking a risk they could not refuse in pursuit of an outcome they could not guarantee, against an adversary whose ultimate strength they could not match. The most honest among them knew the odds. They proceeded anyway, partly from institutional momentum, partly from the political impossibility of backing down from China, partly from a genuine, if ultimately misplaced faith, that their navy's qualitative edge could defy the quantitative logic of industrial warfare. That belief illuminates the limits of what beating the American fleet ever really meant in Japanese strategic thinking. They were never truly planning to win, they were planning to make winning cost too much. And in that gap between those two very different ambitions lies much of the explanation for how the war unfolded the way it did. So where does all of this leave us with the original question? Everything examined across this history, the fleet comparisons, the training edge, the tactical brilliance, the industrial imbalance, the code-breaking disaster at Midway, the attrition campaigns Japan was structurally unequipped to sustain, points toward an answer that resists the satisfying simplicity of yes or no, and that resistance is itself historically meaningful. It tells us something important about the difference between what Japan was genuinely capable of and what it would have needed to be capable of to achieve anything resembling lasting strategic success. Let's make the strongest case for Japan first, because it deserves to be made honestly. In the narrow window between December 1941 and roughly June 1942, Japan possessed what might legitimately be called a genuine window of opportunity. Not for permanent dominance, but for something real and consequential. Its carrier aviation forces were, at that moment, arguably the most lethal concentration of naval air power on the planet. Its surface warfare doctrine was sophisticated and battle-tested. Its pilots were the product of years of intensive training and actual combat experience over China. Its long-lance torpedo outperformed anything the United States Navy was deploying. And critically, the United States Pacific Fleet was partially crippled, its leadership disrupted, its strategic posture reactive rather than offensive. In those months, Japan was not bluffing. The string of victories across Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean raid that drove British naval power back to East Africa, the fall of Singapore, the seizure of the resource zones, these were not accidents. They reflected genuine military capability applied with operational coherence and considerable skill. If you define strong enough to mean capable of seizing strategic initiative, imposing losses on a great power, and establishing a defensive position that would require enormous effort to overcome, then yes, for a brief, specific period, Japan was strong enough to do exactly that. But here is where the distinction between tactical superiority and strategic supremacy becomes not just useful, but essential. Tactical superiority means you win engagements. Operational surprise means you can shape the opening terms of a conflict in your favor. Temporary local control means you can dominate a defined region for a defined time. Japan achieved all three. What Japan could not achieve, and what the evidence strongly suggests it was never structurally capable of achieving, was the fourth and entirely different thing: strategic supremacy over the United States across a sustained conflict. Those are not the same category of accomplishment, and conflating them is the source of most of the confusion surrounding this question. Consider what decisive long-term victory would have actually required. It would have required not merely damaging the American fleet, but eliminating its capacity to regenerate, and American shipbuilding, once fully mobilized, was producing combatants at a rate that Japanese shipbuilding could not approach even in its most optimistic projections. It would have required breaking American will to continue, which depended on political assumptions about domestic opinion that Japanese planners derived more from hope than from evidence. It would have required maintaining the qualitative edge in naval aviation across years of attrition, which was impossible given a training pipeline that could produce excellence in small batches but not at industrial scale. And it would have required that the United States simply not adapt, not improve its radar, not crack Japanese codes, not develop its own doctrine, not leverage an economy 10 times larger to eventually overwhelm whatever Japan could field in response. None of those requirements were plausibly within Japan's reach beyond the short term. What Japan could do, and what it very nearly did, was cripple the Pacific Fleet badly enough to buy time, impose delay, and create the conditions under which a political settlement might conceivably have been extracted. Had the Pearl Harbor attack destroyed the American carrier groups along with the battleships? the timeline of American recovery would have extended significantly. Had Midway gone differently, and it came close enough that dismissing the possibility would be intellectually dishonest, the operational balance in the Pacific would have remained contested well into 1943. These are not trivial counterfactuals. The margin between what happened and what might have happened was, at certain pivotal moments, genuinely narrow. But even in the most favourable versions of those alternative timelines, the fundamental arithmetic did not change. A damaged United States Navy is not a defeated United States Navy. A delayed American counteroffensive is not a cancelled one. Japan's strategic theory, establish the perimeter, impose attrition, exhaust American will, depended on assumptions about political psychology that the actual conduct of the war quickly invalidated. Pearl Harbor, far from shocking the American public into seeking accommodation, produced exactly the unified determination that Yamamoto feared and that Japan's more honest planners had privately warned about. So the balanced judgment looks something like this. Japan was strong enough to strike a devastating blow. Japan was strong enough to seize an enormous empire with remarkable speed. Japan was strong enough to win battles, sometimes against the odds, against a recovering adversary throughout 1942. Japan was briefly strong enough that the outcome of the Pacific War was not a foregone conclusion in its opening phase, and anyone who tells you otherwise is reading the result backward onto a situation that contained real uncertainty at the time. What Japan was not strong enough to do was translate any of those accomplishments into a durable strategic position that the United States lacked the capacity to eventually dismantle. The gap between inflicting shock and achieving victory was, in Japan's case, never really bridged, not because Japanese sailors and aviators lacked courage or skill, but because the kind of war that produces lasting strategic outcomes is ultimately a contest of production, logistics, adaptation, and institutional resilience. And in every one of those dimensions, the United States held advantages that tactical brilliance could not indefinitely offset. This is not a verdict that diminishes what Japan achieved. It is a verdict that clarifies what was actually at stake. Japan could hurt the Pacific Fleet. Japan could delay the Pacific Fleet. Japan could, under sufficiently favourable circumstances, have made the war far longer and more costly than it ultimately was. What Japan could not do was win it, and understanding the precise nature of that limitation, not as a simple failure of nerve or leadership, but as the structural consequence of the mismatch between Japan's ambitions and its capacity to sustain them, is what makes this question worth asking in the first place. That distinction between winning battles and winning the naval war is perhaps the most important lens through which the entire Pacific conflict can be understood, and it's one that Japan's own commanders grasped imperfectly at their peril. Japan's strengths in the opening years of the war were real, documented, and frankly impressive. Its naval doctrine emphasized aggression, precision, and night combat in ways that consistently caught American commanders off guard. Its torpedo technology was genuinely superior. Its carrier aviators, forged through years of relentless training and blooded in the skies over China, were among the most capable in the world. At the moment Japan chose to strike, it wielded those advantages with a coherence and coordination that the United States Navy could not match. Pearl Harbor, the sweep through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean raid. These were not lucky outcomes. They reflected a military force executing near the top of its operational potential. And yet, the entire history examined here points toward a conclusion that Japan's leaders in their most candid moments already feared. Tactical and operational excellence, sustained over months, does not automatically translate into strategic durability sustained over years. Winning battles is a necessary condition for winning wars. It is not a sufficient one. The structural constraints were never really hidden. Japan's oil dependency created a strategic vulnerability that could not be engineered away. It was in fact one of the central reasons Japan went to war in the first place, which meant the war was simultaneously the expression of the problem and the attempted solution to it. Its industrial capacity, while not negligible, operated on a scale that made replacement losses bearable only as long as the attrition remained manageable. Once the grinding campaigns of 1942 and 1943 began consuming pilots, ships, and trained crews faster than the replacement pipeline could replenish them, the qualitative edge that had defined Japan's early war performance started eroding in ways that could not be reversed. And intelligence, the invisible dimension of the war, worked almost entirely against Japan after Midway, stripping away the operational surprise that had been among its most powerful early assets. The most reasonable interpretation of whether Japan could have forced a genuinely different outcome is probably this: it could have made the outcome significantly more costly and considerably more uncertain, particularly in the critical window of 1942. A more complete Pearl Harbor strike, a Midway that went the other way, a more sustainable approach to pilot training and aircraft production. Any of these might have extended the contested phase of the war and created conditions under which political pressures in the United States could have complicated the path to unconditional victory. That is not nothing. Wars are not only decided by material capacity, they are shaped by will, by time, and by the political costs that accumulate along the way. But there is a difference between complicating a war and winning it. The Pacific War was always going to test whether Japan's opening advantages could survive contact with an adversary that was larger, more industrially flexible, and ultimately more capable of learning and adapting at institutional scale. The answer the war provided was clear, even if the path to that answer contained genuine uncertainty along the way. Japan's brilliance at the tactical and operational level was real. Its structural limitations at the strategic and industrial level were equally real, and in a long war structure tends to outlast brilliance. That is, in the end, the broader historical lesson this story carries, one that extends well beyond the Pacific War. Military excellence is not illimitable. A force can be superbly trained, tactically innovative, and operationally daring, and still find itself unable to overcome the deeper realities of industrial capacity, logistical reach, intelligence advantage, and institutional adaptability. The history of warfare is full of smaller, more skilled forces that won the battle and lost the war, forces that mistook early success for strategic position and found that the gap between the two was wider than any amount of tactical virtuosity could bridge. Japan's navy was, at specific moments, genuinely formidable enough to threaten the Pacific Fleet. It was never structurally capable of defeating what the United States was ultimately able to bring to bear. And the tragedy, if that word applies to strategic miscalculation, is that many of Japan's own most capable officers understood this before the first torpedo was ever fired. They chose to fight anyway, hoping that brilliance might somehow substitute for capacity, that a decisive early blow might produce a political outcome that the correlation of forces never truly supported. It didn't, but understanding why it didn't, understanding the precise distance between what Japan could achieve and what victory actually required, is what transforms this from a simple story about who had the bigger navy into something far more instructive about the nature of war itself.